This is an important question I just posed. For the questions we're dealing with today are heaven-hell questions. We know for sure that the Catholic Church is the ark of salvation, outside of which there is no salvation. Pope Boniface VIII infallibly states in Unum Sanctum, "Indeed we declare, say, pronounce, and define that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff." And as a corollary to that, I reason that it is also necessary to have a Roman Pontiff to be subject to. My purpose here is not to prove the fact that the papacy became vacant on October 9, 1958 with the death of Pope Pius XII. I will presume these facts and their logical consequences for many disobey Pope Pius XII and his enactments and judge the law, which we are not allowed to do. Further, many innovations have come in during this unprecedented vacancy, which is also contrary to the law. What I propose to do is analyze what we did and why. They shall not partake of holy things until a high priest shall arise for evidence and truth. This is from the offertory for the votive mass for the election of a pope. Sedevacantists, logically, should be saying this votive mass regularly, as well as praying for the election of a pope. To do otherwise is not consistent with their belief. If the papacy is vacant, then it needs to be filled. The Vatican Council infallibly declares, "If anyone then says that is not from the institution of Christ the Lord himself, or by divine right that the blessed Peter has perpetual successors in the primacy over the universal church, or that the Roman Pontiff is not the successor of blessed Peter in that same primacy, let him be anathema." This is the quote that spoke to me back in 1987 and told me we must elect a pope. And let us go to the oath against the errors of Martinism, which all Catholic subdeacons, deacons, priests, and bishops take the night before their ordination. Thirdly, likewise with a firm faith I believe that the Church, guardian and mistress of the revealed Word, was instituted proximately and directly by the true and historical Christ himself, while he sojourned among us, and that the same was built upon Peter, the chief of the apostolic hierarchy, and his successors until the end of time. Let us address the first possible objection. What if someone had elected a pope prior to my own election on July 16, 1990? This objection was first raised in a visit to Michigan in the summer of 1992, and quite a good objection. Today it seems impossible for two groups to proceed to elect a pope in different parts of the world with modern communication. But we must go back 18 years before the internet made such worldwide communication easy. I answered at the time that our two groups would come together and combine, and both claimants to the papacy would resign in favor of a new combined papal election. Today, in light of the fact that the principle is first in time, first in right, the second man elected would most likely resign in favor of the first. However, the first might also resign in favor of a new election. If he didn't, he would validate all the actions of the man elected second in time, because we would have both proceeded in good faith, and they would most likely be considered valid under the principles of canon law anyway. We can now look back 2 decades, and we know with certainty that the papacy was vacant on July 16, 1990. In fact, prior to the election in 1990, several of us went to great efforts to find out if there was a pope, because if a papal election had occurred, it was a simple matter. Submit to the pope. Nothing else need be done. And we've not stopped studying and confirming the truth of the validity of the election in 1990. And I can say that I am more certain of the validity of the July 16, 1990 papal election today than I was 20 years ago. Nothing makes me have any doubts whatsoever. Let us go back to what was reported in 1990 prior to the papal election, and will the Catholic Church survive the 20th century? First of all, there were the mystical claimants to the papacy in the persons of Clement XV and II Gregory XVII. One of the basic principles is that popes are elected, even if only by one person, as has happened several times in history. God has placed his church in the hands of men and does not intervene in these affairs in this type of manner. Further, it was proven that all three of these mystical claimants were heretics, and under the principles of cum ex apostolatus officio are not eligible for the papacy in the first place. Next we come to the elections. The line from Roncalli to Waitia is certainly invalid because they were heretics prior to the election. This leaves one other proposition which has changed over the years. In 1985, it was proposed that Joseph Cardinal Siri was elected in 1963 and both 1978 conclaves. However, he died on May 2, 1989, having never publicly claimed the papacy. Ironically, after Will the Catholic Church Survive the 20th Century proved the 1963 conclave to be certainly invalid, the Siri theory mutated to claim he was elected in 1958. This was published along with the proposition that Siri had appointed secret cardinals. This arrived in our hands shortly after the July 16, 1990 papal election. The person making these claims was summoning these alleged cardinals together in June of 1990, which proves at that point he thought the papacy was vacant. Further investigation proves that Siri ceased being a Catholic by the recitation of the Novus Ordo Missae, as well as by presiding over the heresies of Vatican II. And thus the papacy was vacant on July 16, 1990. Since the papal election, several internet fictions have arisen, but their claims do not need to even be considered, since they're usually a compilation of pictures pulled off the internet in various places, and the person claiming to be Pope does not even exist. On July 16, 1990, we were morally certain that the papacy was vacant. Moral certainty excludes all reasonable objection, although one could come up with a far-fetched scenario that would go against your proposition. We had concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that the papacy was vacant, and this is sufficient. Even if it had been discovered that we had erred, the solution would have been simple, and God will not condemn a person who makes the effort necessary to find the truth and proceeds to act in good faith. Further, St. Antoninus of Florence says, although it is necessary to believe that there is but one supreme head of the Church, nevertheless, if it happens that two popes are created at the same time, it is not necessary for the people to believe that this one or that one is the legitimate pontiff. They must believe that he alone is the true pope who has been regularly elected, and they are not bound to discern who that one is. As to that point, they may be guided by the conduct and opinion of their particular pastor. Let's put this in context. He was writing at the Western Schism and the decision people had to make. But the main point here is that one is following one of the popes. One must follow a living, breathing pope. And that's what St. Antoninus is saying here. Now, at that time, it was simple. They could follow their pastors. With the great apostasy, all of our pastors, our bishops and our pastors, had defected from the faith. We have no pastors. So we have to make a decision, and we must proceed. Now, obviously, we cannot follow a heretical usurper, which is why we reject Joe Ratzinger and his predecessors. In May of 1976, Father Sainz Arriaga and Father Moises Carmona met with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre at St. Jude's Shrine in Stafford, Texas, to discuss the election of a pope. Father Karl Pulvermacher, OFM, was influenced by this and gave a sermon almost a year later when he stated, first of all, that the papacy was indeed vacant and that someday we would have to elect our own pope. In 1981, Bishop Peter Martin Yule Den Took consecrated 3 men as bishops to prepare for a papal election. In this picture you can see Father Carmona talking with Father George Musey in May of 1982. The election of a pope was also discussed in January of 1983 in Louisiana with Bishop Took in attendance. Father Musey also discussed this in an open letter to Archbishop Lefebvre in November of 1983. In 1979, Archbishop Lefebvre had asked, "Who will tell us who the future pope is to be? How, as there are no cardinals, is he to be chosen?" On May 2, 1989, Joseph Siri died. This left only the ultra-modernist Emile Leger as the last remaining man appointed cardinal by Pope Pius XII. He had fallen into heresy long before, so there were no cardinals left. Papal election law for almost a millennium had limited the election of a pope to the cardinals. The Catholic Church is a perfect society. This means that it always has a way here and now to provide itself with a pope if the papacy is vacant. St. Alphonsus states that even fraud will not invalidate a papal election, and this is borne out by history. All that is required is that the papacy be vacant and that the electors be Catholic. Of course, the one elected must also be a Catholic and be a man with the use of reason. Pope Pius XII provides that excommunications do not bar one from voting or being elected to the papacy. Pope Pius XII also followed Pope St. Pius X in stating that simony does not invalidate a papal election. In fact, nothing invalidates a papal election with the sole exception mentioned by Pope Paul IV in the infallible bull Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio, and that is the election of a notorious heretic. The reason is simple. A heretic has ceased to be a Catholic, and thus cannot become head of the church he has departed from.